Hello, friends, and let's get started.
James stood in the center of the bright, garlanded hall, surrounded by old friends and good-natured toasts. His wife, Melissa, took a few steps away, looking around. She held a glass of champagne in her hands, and her gaze slid restlessly through the crowd. This wedding, like a theatrical production, looked perfect, but there was nothing festive inside. She felt like a guest at someone else's party, like a casual observer. She and James had been married for 7 years now, and in that time, wedding celebrations had lost their former luster for her. She had once dreamed of such a fairy tale, but now every such evening only served to reinforce her inner emptiness. James had retreated into the circle of his old friends, the talk of college, of basketball games, of exploits long since erased from her memory. None of it moved her, and it seemed to even annoy her. Melissa moved toward the terrace exit, figuring the coolness of the evening air might revitalize her a little. She knew James would hardly notice her absence. It was becoming a habit by now. Opening the glass door, she inhaled a full breath. It was fresh and quiet outside. Pendant lights illuminated the table surrounded by tall, wrought iron chairs. The guests spoke in muffled voices, and those rare words mingled with the music coming from inside. Melissa walked over to one of the tables, set down her glass, and leaned against the parapet, admiring the view of the city at night. She tried not to think about how bored she had become in her own marriage. She just enjoyed the silence. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" A man's voice suddenly sounded. Melissa flinched. She turned and saw a tall man standing a little to the side. In his hand was a glass of red wine. He was looking at her with a soft smile and a touch of interest. She hadn't noticed him before, and he had apparently been watching her for some time. "Yes," she answered uncertainly, lowering her gaze. "Quiet and still. Sometimes that's all you need. Quiet but not lonely, I hope?" He clarified, moving closer. "Lonely?" Melissa looked up at him. His eyes were confident, bordering on cocky. "No, I was just getting some fresh air." He held out his hand. "David, a friend of the groom's. I don't think we've met yet." She looked at his hand, then at him. "Melissa," she replied, shaking his palm. His handshake was firm, but not overly so. There was some benevolent insistence in it, but no pressure. "I saw you inside," David said, releasing her hand. "But you disappeared so quickly that I thought you'd already left. Apparently you'd just come up for air." He smiled, his gaze lingering on her face a little longer than necessary. "Your husband is one of Sasha's friends, right?" Melissa nodded, taking her time to answer. She felt a slight stirring in his presence that she couldn't explain. Something in the way he spoke, in his confidence, as if to say, "I know what I want." She liked it, though she tried not to show it. "Yeah, they've known each other since college," she said finally. "And you? Are you from his college company, too?" "Not exactly," he answered, leaning forward a little. "We met through mutual friends. We just hit it off right away. Sasha is that kind of person. If you're his friend, it's for life." He paused, looking at her. "How long have you and James been together?" Melissa felt her cheeks turn slightly pink. She didn't want to discuss her marriage, but she couldn't refuse to talk about it. "It's been 7 years," she answered briefly. David nodded, as if he understood something. "A long time," he said thoughtfully. "Are you happy?" Melissa tensed. It was too direct a question, and she didn't know how to answer it. "What did you want to hear? Why did he care? Why do you ask?" she said, trying to look indifferent. David grinned. "I'm just curious. Sometimes it's interesting to know how the people you meet in places like this live. You know, weddings are always a kind of theater. Everybody plays their parts." Melissa felt her heart beat faster. Something in his words caught her. She glanced at him with a touch of suspicion, but didn't say anything back. He didn't seem aggressive or intrusive, but there was something more than curiosity in his words. "I'm sorry if I'm being too blunt," David said, taking a step back. "It's just that you seem like an interesting person. Sometimes it's nice to talk to someone who sees things differently." He raised his glass as if to end the conversation. "To your kindness, and to quiet evenings outdoors." Melissa couldn't help but smile. She was pleased that he'd left, leaving behind a slight sense of intrigue. She watched him walk back into the hall and felt a strange feeling build up in her. It wasn't fear or anxiety, but something much more complex. It was as if there was an unexpected element in her life that she couldn't control. She wanted to return to the conversation, to learn more, but at the same time something held her back. That moment stuck in her memory like a shard of glass in the palm of her hand, tiny but tangible. Melissa stepped out of the crowded hall and into the dimly lit corridor. Her feet had led her here, away from the people, the music, and the constant reminder that her life was a smooth, predictable line. She looked around. The hallway was long, with low ceilings and gray carpeting. On the walls hung paintings of lifeless landscapes that no one seemed to like. The raucous noise was left behind, but the sounds of the party still came, muffled and indistinct. "I thought you'd never decide to leave," said a calm voice. She turned around. David was standing by the door jamb, holding a glass of red wine in his hand. His figure seemed part of the gloomy interior, but his gaze was alive, keen. "Did you think it was too noisy inside?" Melissa answered, trying to sound calm. Her voice sounded a little more harsh than she'd expected. "Exactly. And I thought, where's the smart woman who realizes that weddings can sometimes be a little too played out? I was just getting some air," she said, smiling slightly to soften her tone. "You're right, though, it's all a bit cloying." "Pretentious?" "Oh, I'd call it stifling." David took a step forward. His shoes slid faintly on the carpet. "But there are some people who flourish under such conditions. They like the feeling of power, of influence, showing themselves to be better than they are. And I'm glad I'm not the only one who sees that." Melissa felt her cheeks heat up slightly. She took a couple steps to the side, as if trying to get away from his direct gaze, but he continued. "You seem to be the kind of person who doesn't want to waste time playing games. Too smart for that." She paused. As if sensing her confusion, David set his glass down on the table and said more quietly, "I apologize if I've been too blunt. It's just that you, shall we say, stand out. For the better." Melissa looked up at him. For a moment, a thought flashed through her mind. Why not answer honestly? Why not admit that she was sick of it all? Too, that she felt lonely. But instead she just nodded, as if in agreement. "Thank you for the compliment," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Compliments aren't just for beauty," David smiled. "They're sincere if they come from the right person. And I think you know what I mean." Her gaze lingered on his lips for a moment. In that brief moment, her inner tension was replaced by something else. She didn't know what to call the feeling, but it filled the space between them. David tilted his head slightly, letting her know he was waiting for her reaction. Melissa took a step back. I should probably go back." Her voice sounded strained. David smiled a little wider, taking a step back. "Of course, but if you decide to stay, I'll be here." He pointed toward the couch by the window. "I'm in no hurry to go anywhere." She froze for a moment, then turned and took a couple steps toward the door leading back into the hall. But suddenly she stopped. Her breathing got a little faster, and she turned around. David was sitting on the couch, leaning back slightly. His gaze was calm, serene, yet anticipatory. She felt her legs feel, as if she had taken a step toward him on her own. Melissa sat down next to him. David didn't move, but his smile grew a little wider. She put her hands in her lap, trying not to look in his direction. "You realize this isn't quite right, don't you?" she finally asked without raising her eyes. "What is?" His voice was quiet, but there was a note of irony in it. "Well, the fact that She waved her hand, trying to express her thoughts. David turned to her, his hand barely touching her elbow. "If you really think that, why are you still here?" Her breathing hitched. Everything was raging inside her, but outwardly she remained motionless. They were so close together that she had to look into his eyes. There was everything in them: confidence, understanding, defiance. She raised her hand slowly, put it on his shoulder, and at that moment he leaned toward her. Their first kiss was short but deep. Melissa felt her heart race, and a barely perceptible moan escaped her lips. She pulled away, but David didn't let her pull away. His hands found their way to her waist, and she realized she could no longer resist. Everything else was erased: her doubts, her morals, even her thoughts of James. She just felt this moment, his warmth, his scent, his lips. At that moment, the door to the other end of the hallway suddenly opened. Melissa flinched. David quickly pulled away, and they both looked in the direction of the sound. A second stretched like an eternity, but no one entered. Melissa felt her breathing hitch. She rose abruptly from the couch and whispered, "I have to go." David slowly stood up, watching her. His gaze was insistent, but he didn't say a word. "Goodbye," she added before hurriedly walking back out into the hall, feeling her heart continue to beat like crazy. David stood up, stepped closer, and touched her shoulder. Melissa trembled at that touch. She looked up at him. Her face reflected a mixture of fear, desire, and something unknown. David was silent, but his gaze spoke more than words. Their breaths mingled, and when he leaned into her lips, she didn't pull away. The kiss was deeper than it had been before. He enveloped her, and everything else ceased to exist. Melissa pulled back, but he held her back. For a moment, her hand slid down his shoulder, then down his back. She felt the heat of his body, the tension of his muscles. There was no stopping this moment. They were closer than ever. She turned toward the door at the end of the hallway that led to a small recreation room. He looked into her eyes as if asking permission, but she had already taken a step toward that door. They stepped inside. The room was darkish, with a single dim lamp in the corner. Melissa barely had time to close the door before David pressed her against the wall. She felt his fingers sliding around her waist, his lips touching her neck. Everything was happening quickly, almost impetuous, but there was some inescapable, primal passion in it. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck somewhere in her throat. He pulled her dress up, and his hands were on her hips. It was as if they'd forgotten where they were. Everything was forgotten: the gala, the guests, the morals. All that remained was this moment, filled with pure pleasure. David lifted her up, and she felt him kiss her, more and more insistently. Their bodies merged in that brief, but deafeningly vivid moment. Her fingers clutched his shoulders, and she only had time to whisper his name before their breaths became one. After that, they were silent. David pulled her against him, stroking her hair. Melissa only closed her eyes, trying to get her hitched breath back. She knew this moment would change a lot of things, but in that moment, they both decided it was too soon to think about it. All that remained in the room were their voices, their breathing, and the realization of what had been done. The morning after the wedding greeted Melissa with a strange silence. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the thick curtains of their bedroom, but instead of morning warmth, it brought with it anxiety. James was still asleep, face buried in his pillow, his breathing measured and even. Melissa stared at his back, feeling a lump in her throat. She wanted to forget everything that had happened yesterday. Wanted to pretend it was just a bad dream that would soon be forgotten. But instead, she lay there, clutching her phone tightly in her hand, and replayed moments from last night in her head. She closed her eyes for a second, but immediately opened them again. David's image appeared so vividly before her, as if he were standing right beside her bed. His gaze, his voice, his touch, all of it suddenly came over her with renewed intensity. She inhaled deeply, trying to cope with the rising panic. She needed some kind of distraction, but thoughts of him wouldn't let go. Through her sleep, James moved slightly and mumbled something inaudible. Melissa froze. Her heart beat faster, as if she was afraid he'd guess her thoughts, realize how she felt. She stared at the screen of her phone, trying to decide if she should text him. Maybe he'd already forgotten about her, thought it was just a random episode. But what if he hadn't? Finally, she opened the messaging app and wrote a short, "Good morning." Her fingers trembled as she sent the message. Her heart was beating so loudly that she felt as if it would wake James. The reply came almost instantly, "Good morning. How are you?" Melissa ran her fingers across the screen, looking at the message. It seemed to her that those few words had somehow strengthened her bond with David. She typed, "Fine. How about you?" But before she hit send, she stopped. She erased the text, looked at her sleeping husband again, and felt a wave of regret rise to her throat. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She glanced at the clock. It was still early. James would probably sleep for another couple hours, especially after last night's fun. She typed in another message, "It's okay, I guess. Did you leave late last night?" "Yeah, late enough," he replied almost immediately. Where are you headed now? The answer came a little later, to another city. Work. Leaving tomorrow night. Those words gave her a strange feeling. A mixture of disappointment and relief swept over her. Maybe this was the end. Maybe this would be easier. But before she could think, she was already typing. Would you like to meet before you leave? She sent the message, not realizing how easily she'd agreed to see him again. She didn't even think about how right it was. Just waited for his response. After a few seconds, the screen lit up. I was thinking the same thing. Tonight. Melissa clutched the phone in her hand, feeling her heart skip a beat. She quickly texted, yeah, I think I can make it out. Send it again. Immediately she hesitated. Her fingers began to drum nervously on the bedspread. She glanced over at James. He was still asleep. It was like a small window through which to do something while no one saw. Like a cherished once-in-a-lifetime moment. Melissa spent the rest of the day thinking. She tried to keep to her usual routine, but the thought of meeting David kept her on her mind. She checked her phone every few minutes, as if she was afraid he would change his mind. She reassured herself that she would just talk to him, nothing more. It's just a conversation, just one meeting. No sequel, no second mistake. But deep down she knew it was a lie. She left the house that evening, tossing James, I have to meet a friend. He didn't even look up from the TV, just nodded and wished her a good time. Melissa looked at him with pain in her chest. Why had everything become so indifferent? Why was he no longer interested in where she was going? She turned around, walked out of the house, and got into her car. Her fingers trembled as she typed the address into the navigator. David was waiting for her at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was quiet inside, and she saw him sitting by the window almost immediately. He stood up as she approached and smiled. His smile was calm, warm, but at the same time it felt like there was something more to it. She took a seat across from him, trying to look collected even though everything was bubbling up inside. Thank you for coming, he said, looking into her eyes. It probably wasn't the best decision, Melissa replied, trying to sound composed. And yet here you are. She couldn't argue. Her gaze met his, and she felt her resolve begin to melt again. They only had a little time, and they knew there would be no excuses this time. After a while, they left the food unfinished and went outside to the car. There was a cool breeze outside, and Melissa suddenly realized that she didn't feel like going home at all. David looked at her as if he knew her thoughts. Do you want to go for a little more ride? He asked in a voice that sounded as simple as if he was asking if she wanted another cup of coffee. She nodded. They drove to a small motel that David had already spotted along the way. In the parking lot, he stopped the car, and Melissa stared out the window, trying to collect her thoughts. But as soon as he turned off the engine, she turned to him and met his gaze. In that moment, they both knew they couldn't help themselves. Words weren't needed. Their hands reached for each other. Melissa felt her palms slide over his face as he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer. She closed her eyes, feeling his breath against her face, and the next second their lips came together in a long, hot kiss. They went upstairs to a small room with warm light from a bedside lamp. Melissa didn't think about what was happening. She just felt it, his touch, his kisses, his warmth. All her doubts, guilt, and fears vanished in that moment. She was lost in his arms, giving herself to this moment completely. When they were in bed, their bodies merged as if they had known each other for a long time. They moved in sync, passionately, without thinking of the consequences. It was like a release, like an escape from the reality that had held her in its grip for so long. James sat in the kitchen, twirling a cup of coffee in his hands, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about Melissa's behavior had changed. Every day was getting harder. She was becoming more withdrawn, her answers short and scattered. And the strangest thing was her cell phone. It wasn't immediately noticeable, but now James could see her carrying it around with her all the time, never leaving it for even a few minutes. When he asked what she was doing, she only evaded answering. One evening, sitting next to him, he noticed her fingers sliding quickly across the screen, reading and deleting messages. It was so obvious that he couldn't help but notice. When she left to go to the bathroom, he decided to check her phone. She didn't put a password on it, never hid anything, and that freaked him out. He didn't expect to find any evidence, but he opened it anyway. The messages were, as always, from people he knew, co-workers, friends. Nothing suspicious at all. He even felt relieved. But some sense of unease never left him. Everything was too smooth, too clean. A few days later, he caught her hiding her phone again, laying it face down. She said she was late and headed off to a meeting with colleagues. But her car was left in the parking lot, and she wasn't answering her phone herself. James didn't know what to think. He tried to convince himself that it was all small things, that he was too paranoid. But his intuition was screaming that there was something here. The next morning, she went to work again and again didn't answer his call. James felt the tension building as his own thoughts began to haunt him, causing a growing sense of jealousy and fear. He knew he could no longer ignore his suspicions. He couldn't even imagine where this was all going to lead. Melissa hurried to work, hurriedly buttoning her coat while trying to hold her bag and car keys in her hands. At the door, she turned around, shouting, "See you tonight," and quickly slammed the door behind her. James, who was still drinking coffee in the kitchen, just nodded, not even looking in her direction. It was a familiar morning ritual. She left, he stayed. It had been like that for months, but today something had gone wrong. A few minutes after she left, James went into the bedroom to clean up the scattered clothes and noticed her phone on the nightstand. The screen was still glowing, showing an incoming notification. He paused, trying to decide what to do. He didn't want to pry into her personal life, but the suspicions that had plagued him for the last few weeks forced him to act. First, he just looked at the screen. There was a message from an unfamiliar number, short but meaningful. "I can't wait to see you again." James took a deep breath, then slowly picked up his phone and began scrolling through the messages. The first thing that caught his eye was their frequency. Several messages in a row, every day. He didn't know the number, but the tone of the text left no doubt. The words were too personal, too explicit. Some of them made his heart clench. "Tonight I couldn't think of anyone but you. When will we be together again? And finally, you're the most amazing woman I've ever met." James felt his hands begin to shake. Anger mixed with pain was spilling into his chest. He found it hard to breathe. He couldn't believe this was real. He went back into the kitchen, sat down at the table, and put the phone in front of him, staring at it as if it was the culprit for all his troubles. After a few minutes, he got up and started pacing around the room. There were 1,000 questions swirling around in his head. Why did she do this? How long had this been going on? He tried to collect his thoughts, but his feelings took over. When Melissa got home, James was already standing in the kitchen doorway, clutching the phone in his hand. She didn't even have time to take off her coat before he held the phone out to her and asked, "What is it?" There was a pain in his voice that he could no longer hide. Melissa froze. Her face went pale. Her gaze darted around the room, but she couldn't think of anything to say. She tried to smile, pretending nothing was wrong. "What do you mean?" "It's just my phone." James didn't let her finish. "You don't have to lie to me. I've seen the messages." "Who are they from?" His voice rose. He threw the phone on the table, but he restrained himself, trying not to let rage take over. He wanted to hear the truth. Melissa looked nervously at the phone, then at James. She noticed his face contorted in pain. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck. It seemed to take forever before she squeezed out, "It's just a friend, James." "You got it all wrong." James pounded his fist on the table. "I've seen it all. Those texts aren't just friendship. Are you cheating on me? Tell me the truth." He glared at her, waiting for the answer that would change everything. His face flamed with anger, but there was pleading in his eyes. He didn't want to believe it. He hoped she would say something that would make his doubts disappear. Melissa lowered her head, unable to look him in the eyes. Her voice trembled as she spoke. It happened so fast. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." James took a step back as if her words had hit him physically. He pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to comprehend what he had just heard. "You didn't even try to explain. You just covered it up. How long has this been going on?" His voice wasn't as loud anymore, but you could hear the desperate attempt to figure it out in it. Melissa lifted her head and, looking him straight in the eye, finally said, "I fell in love with him." The words burst out of her as if she couldn't hold them in any longer. Immediately after, she covered her mouth with her hand, realizing that nothing could be taken back. James stood motionless. His eyes were wide open and his breathing hitched. The words came out like a thunderclap. He looked at her, and there was rage, pain, and disappointment in his gaze. They both realized that the point of no return had been passed. A heavy silence filled the room. James took another step back, as if he wanted to leave but couldn't. Melissa stepped forward, holding out her hand as if hoping to hold him back. He pulled back, however, raising his hand to keep her from coming any closer. His face contorted in pain, and then he finally asked, "Do you have any idea how I feel right now?" His voice sounded like he was on edge, but he was still trying to understand. Melissa didn't answer. She just stood there, feeling her own life crumbling around her. In that moment, their marriage, which had seemed so strong only a short time ago, was on the brink. James took a deep breath, but couldn't calm himself. His hands were shaking, and everything inside was screaming. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Melissa standing alone. She heard the sound of the door closing, and the sound echoed in her head. When James left, slamming the door so that the windows in the living room rattled, Melissa sank down onto the couch, wrapping her arms around her head. She was still trying to call him, sending several texts, but he wasn't answering. Deep down, she knew he needed time to cool down, but her fear was growing by the minute. She was afraid that his anger wouldn't go away, that he would never want to listen to her again. She was afraid she'd already lost him. She remembered the look on his face as he walked away. It had been disappointment. She could almost feel him pulling away from her. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, but there was no relief. After weeks of silence, James showed up unexpectedly. Melissa received a quick text, "I'll be there tomorrow night. We need to talk." Her heart raced. She wanted this meeting, longed for a chance to explain everything, to find a way to win him back. She had convinced herself that all was not yet lost, that she would be able to right the wrongs. When he walked into the house, however, her heart stopped. James looked collected, almost cold. This was not the James she knew. He sat down at the table, inviting her to take a seat across from him. Melissa coughed nervously, ready to begin, but he gestured for her to stop. "I want you to hear me," he began quietly. "I've been thinking for a long time about how we should proceed. I've been trying to figure out where I went wrong, why you chose to do what you did. I've tried to find the strength to forgive, but I can't." "James, please," she interrupted, feeling tears come to her eyes. "I made a mistake, but I'm ready to make it right. Fix it?" His voice became harsher. "How are you going to make up for betraying me? That you made a fool of me in front of our friends, in front of our family? Did you think I wouldn't notice? That I would look the other way while you built a relationship with another man?" Melissa tried to explain, to say it was a mistake, a weakness. But James wasn't listening anymore. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket and placed it in front of her. "It's a divorce agreement. I hired a lawyer and made sure the division was fair. I'm not going to retaliate. I don't want anything from you. Just sign it. And by the way," he hesitated but continued, looking her straight in the eye, "I've decided to tell our loved ones." Melissa looked up sharply. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because I'm tired of living in the shadow of your lies. I won't hide the truth. This isn't revenge. This is dotting the I's." She felt her world crumble. Everything she'd tried to keep, everything she'd hoped to hide, came crashing down on her with one single phrase. She knew that once the truth came out, her family would turn on her, her friends would stop talking to her. Her career, built on trust, would be jeopardized. She looked at James, who seemed like a stranger now. He stood up, grabbed his jacket from the table, and headed for the door. "I don't want anything more to do with you." We were done. The door closed, leaving Melissa in silence. She looked at the contract, then at the phone, which never rang. She was alone in a house that now seemed foreign to her. This ending was something she hadn't expected. She lost. James had saved face, and her world had crumbled to dust. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.